that the village was occupied. But if we emerged unscathed, the chances are that the village was not occupied. Now, it so happened that Noel Bell produced a marvelous air photograph of the village of Hubert Folly and the surrounding area. And of course, this meant that I didn't have to fuss around with maps. And also at this moment, Bill Smith Osborne, who commanded H Battery of 13 RHA, offered his services. And he decided to put a heavy artillery concentration down on Hubert Folly as we approached to the village. And the last shell was to be a phosphorus one. And this was the signal for us to start on our journey down the village. And believe you me, once we'd started, there was no time for sauntering. And within seconds, we appeared at the other end of the village and reported back to Noel Bell and told him that we had met no resistance and had seen no sign of the enemy. But how wrong one can be, because as we discovered later, the village was groaning with enemy.
Reassured by the results of the recce, third tanks started to advance. Let us look at the concentration of fire that awaited them from Bras, Bourgebus and Hubert-Folly. The enemy in Hubert-Folly watched the left-hand squadron come along the line of the embankment and take up position just behind some hedgerows. Squadrons were covering about 1,000 yards at this time.
As we moved towards Bras and were within a few hundred yards short of the village, the whole of my squadron came under extremely heavy anti-tank gun fire from Hubert-Folly, Bras, and the direction of Ifs. And within a matter of moments, 4 or 5 of my squadron had been knocked out. I felt a hell of a crack on my tank. I hopped up and saw the remainder of the crew out. And I then saw that the left rear of the tank had been completely shot away from an AP shot from the direction of Goodwood, which must be 2,500 yards away. I waved my tank crew back towards the embankment and then dashed over toward my headquarter tanks. One had been knocked out, but the other one was okay, and so I hopped into that one and resumed control of the squadron. I tucked myself in behind a short bushy hedge and took another troop of tanks with me. At this time, I could see the 2 left-hand squadrons were also heavily engaged by AP fire. We could see targets in both the villages. I had a troop sergeant with me in my little funk hole, and I got him to put down some AP fire on the anti-tank guns on the western edge of Bras. And he succeeded in knocking out 2 guns, and we also claimed a couple of assault guns as well. But there was considerable fire coming from Hubert-Folly. We, at that time, were broadside on, and it was extremely dangerous. Every time we tried to move forward, we lost more tanks. The left-hand squadron had moved out from their hedgerow, leaving 2 troops further forward. But these were quickly knocked out, and the remainder of the squadron had to withdraw slightly. It was pretty obvious that as soon as you got above the line of the embankment, you received casualties from the area of Bourgebus. At this time, the carrier platoon of G Company were doing absolutely sterling work, going up to the burning tanks, helping the wounded tank crews, putting them in their carriers and half-tracks, and bringing them back to the RAP down by the embankment. So, in a matter of an hour or so, this beautiful, peaceful scene had been transformed into an absolute battlefield.
Now the situation had changed considerably. You heard in some detail how the 3rd tanks got on west of the railway line, but meanwhile a good deal had been happening to the 5 and 4 Fire Yeomanry and 23rd Hussars. Now the 5 and 4 Fire Yeomanry had continued their advance, less one squadron, which of course had already been knocked out, through the area of 4, and one troop got up to the track between Borquebus and La Hogue. They were knocked out. And so were many other tanks knocked out, including the commanding officer's tank. In fact, communication with them was lost for some time. And then it was discovered that they had lost 40 tanks. Meanwhile, the 23rd Hussars had been moved forward from the area Manneville, Le Prieur, having been, of course, relieved by the Guards Armed Division, and they moved forward on the left of Granteville here, and also started to receive casualties. So the Armour Brigade was now held up by strong and accurate fire along the whole front. Now, at 12 o'clock, I met the Corps Commander, General O'Connor, and the Commander of 7th Armed Division, General Erskine, just behind Le Mesnil-Fremantle. And I explained the situation to them, and I explained too that all these small villages, all inter-supporting, were held by strong anti-tank guns, either from tanks or from the ground. And no real advance could be achieved unless they were all dealt with or neutralized at the same time. I said that as my objectives were over to the right, I couldn't do much more until the gap between ourselves and the Guards on our left was taken over by the 7th Armed Division. General Erskine understood this, and he said that he would get his division forward as soon as possible and fill that gap and take over their line of advance. So I had great hopes that during the afternoon we would see the arrival of the 7th Armed Division, and we would be able to continue our advance towards our objectives over on the right.
In fact, the afternoon wore on with no sign of the 7th Armoured Division, who appeared to have had difficulty crossing the minefields at the start line. The Guards Armoured Division continued to try to take Cagny and finally succeeded at about 1600 hours. 11th Armoured Division had little more success. During the afternoon, Granteville was attacked and eventually cleared, but all attempts to reach Four or Solier were defeated with heavy loss. Meanwhile, with 3rd tanks unable to move forward, their motor company was subjected to heavy fire.
And wherever we moved, so these enemy shells followed us. And it wasn't made any easier because at this time we were tending to the gallant burnt crews from our own tanks who had suffered terribly throughout the day's fighting. But fortunately, at about this time, another section of the carrier platoon, commanded by a sergeant, moving up in the lee of the embankment, came upon a very gallant German who was controlling the artillery fire. And when he was dispatched, so mercifully the artillery fire ceased. And it was then that Noel Bell, with his clutter around him, was able to make his way back to Colonel David Silvertop and tell him that he thought that in this essentially armored battle, there was nothing much that the motor company could do. And so the colonel directed G Company to move the other side of the railway embankment.
In front of the halted British advance, Colonel von Luck's reorganized defenses were about to be further strengthened.
At about 1530 hours, I got a very encouraging message from the division headquarters that the 1st SS Panzer Division in reserve near Falaise would come up to the Borgbusch to take over the positions, to reinforce us and to counterattack the British advance. My order remains the same, to protect our right flank and to protect the flank from any penetrations to the southeast. In fact, some first elements of the 1st SS Panther Regiment as recce troops came onto the Borgbusch at about 200 hours in the afternoon, followed by infantry who got its positions on the Borgbusch during the night of 18th to 19th. During this night, our positions on the Borgbusch and on the right flank could be strengthened until the whole 1st SS Panzer Division got into its positions.
By evening, General Roberts was growing concerned about the enemy counterattacks, which had been increasing during the afternoon. So he moved 159 Infantry Brigade into defensive positions around Le Mesnil-Frémantel and 29th Armoured Brigade into positions round Granteville. The Northamptonshire Yeomanry remained protecting the right rear of 29th Armoured Brigade.
And so, at the end of the day, the 29th Armoured Brigade had lost 126 tanks. 26 in the 23rd Hussars, and the 5th and 4th and the 3rd tanks about 40 each. It was quite clear that we must reorganize, bring up what reinforcements there were, and that we needed a new corps plan for the following day.
On the following day, a new plan was made, the outline of which was, at 1600 hours, the 11th Armoured Division would attack Bras and subsequently Hubert-Folly from Bras. At 1700 hours, the 7th Armoured Division would attack Bourguebus and Four. At the same time, the Guards Armoured Division would attack Poirier and subsequently exploit to Fresneauville. All these attacks would be supported by artillery firing high explosive and smoke. By the morning of the 19th, the 1st SS Panzer Division had appeared in force on the ridge. Their Panthers took heavy toll on any tanks which ventured into the open ground within range. The plan for the 11th Armoured Division attack was that F and H companies would assault Bras, supported by the Northamptonshire Yeomanry. G Company would then assault Hubert-Folly, supported by 3rd Tanks.
In spite of repeated warnings, both from the divisional commander and myself, the Northamptonshire Yeomanry went too far to the west and were so heavily mauled that they could not support the attack on Bras. However, 3rd Tank switched roles and gave support to the attack on Bras. It was here that I lost my 2nd tank of the battle. On this occasion, both the driver and co-driver were killed. And once more, I changed tanks and entered Bras with the infantry. By 1900 hours, Bras was clear. 3rd Tanks had only 11 tanks left. From my point of view, in my squadron, I had lost 17 out of 19 tanks in the 2 days.
In spite of a further change of plan, in which once more the unfortunate Northamptonshire Yeomanry were unable to support an attack, G Company attacked Hubert-Folly, supported by the Fife and Forfar Yeomanry. Within 1 hour, the village was in our hands.
The attack on Bras and Hubert-Folly was an excellent example of the cooperation of armour, motor battalion, infantry, artillery, coupled with the use of smoke. And by the end of the day, on the 19th, 11th Armoured Division were on the western end of the Bourguebus Ridge.
The Guards had captured Le Poirier, but had failed to take Fresneauville. 7th Armoured had taken Four, but had failed to capture Bourguebus. In fact, both Fresneauville and Bourguebus were to fall before Operation Goodwood ended in torrential rain on the 21st of July. The fact is that in 3.5 days, a British corps of 3 armoured divisions, 877 tanks in all, had advanced less than 10 miles at a total cost of 437 tanks. But they had gained the ridge and the field of battle was theirs. Before them, the ridge stretched on, but the German defences were shallow and the ground less suitable for defence in depth.
The 18th and 19th of July were very difficult and in a certain way frustrating days for us, but our defense could hold a greatly superior force from breaking out. The reasons were, on the British side, their tanks were outgunned by our anti-tank defense. They did not make the best use, of their air and artillery bombardment. And until the attacks on Bra and Hubert Verlee, they did not use their arms in a cooperating way. From our side,